Hey, it's Greg Brown, the storyteller, poet laureate of aviation. Grab your logbook, because it's time for another flying carpet cockpit adventure. I'm an aviation author, adventure columnist, photographer, and former National Flight Instructor of the Year. The Flying Carpet is a 4-place single-engine light airplane. In it, my wife Jean and I have long traveled the North American continent, searching behind clouds for the real America. Learn more at my website, gregbrownflyingcarpet.com, where you can also see photos from most episodes. While there, order one of the few remaining autographed copies of my aviation adventure book, Flying Carpet, The Soul of an Airplane, for which I was named Barnes & Noble Arizona Author of the Month. My family and I recently had occasion to remember my dad on what would have been his 100th birthday. He was an interesting guy with an interesting aviation background, and to honor him on that 100th birthday, I decided to put together this podcast. This story is drawn from my book, Flying Carpet, The Soul of an Airplane. Okay, the time has come to climb into the flying carpet, buckle up your seatbelt, and prepare for takeoff on today's episode. Best landing anyone ever made. Clear prop. "We're out of control," yelled my father, grabbing the wheel. "No, we're not," I replied, grabbing it back. Overriding my father wasn't easy. He'd been a pilot since before I was born. After training in a Piper Cub, he bought his first airplane in 1949, a tiny fabric-covered Aranca Chief. Soon afterward, he traded for an all-metal air coupe, which he landed in a Missouri farm field to wait out thunderstorms. Pilots don't do that sort of thing much anymore. "We're in trouble. I'm taking over the plane." "Dad, please believe me, we'll be okay." Next had come a triple-tailed Blanca Cruiser. "Most efficient airplane I ever owned," Dad used to tell me. It flew 150 miles per hour on 150 horsepower. He earned his instrument rating in that Blanca using just a headset, compass, and turn and bank indicator. Back then, pilots flew quote-unquote oral range. Using Morse code, the sound of the letter A indicated one side of the course, dot dash, while N denoted the other, dash dot. On-course aviators were treated to a steady tone. No frilly GPS or moving maps in those days. My dad's one metal bender occurred in that treasured Blanca, which had retractable landing gear manually extended by many turns of a crank. Approaching New Orleans one day on instruments, he was interrupted by radio calls and forgot to finish lowering the wheels. Fortunately, damage was slight and his bird soon flew again. "We're icing up," shouted my father, jolting me back to the present. "Dad," I replied, "we'll be home in 20 minutes. Please relax." Serving in the Air Force as a flight surgeon during the Korean conflict, my father tried the controls of early jets such as the T-33 and B-47. But he was proudest of authorization to land his Blanca on base in San Antonio, often flying it home on leave to see my mom in Chicago. After his tour in the service, my dad moved up to V-tailed Bonanzas, 3 in a row. Then, in 1960, he bought the hottest personal airplane of its day, a twin-engine Cessna 310. We kids knew it was a big deal because Sky King flew one on his popular TV Western. It was easy enough to imagine ourselves chasing those bad guys in our own airplane. Heck, Sky's Songbird was even painted like ours, though we couldn't be sure it was the same two-tone green from our black and white television set. It took more than TV adventures to satisfy my dad, however. With my mother, he flew frequently to Canada, Mexico, and islands of the Caribbean. My mom, although afraid of water, even accompanied him 650 miles offshore to Bermuda, though she declined his biggest aviation adventure. That occurred in 1962, when my father swapped the 310's backseat for a 140-gallon gas tank and flew with his friend Eddie Hayes to Europe. They didn't take the northern route commonly flown by light airplanes via Greenland, Iceland, and Scotland, but instead navigated via Newfoundland and the Azores Islands to Portugal. The longest overwater leg exceeded 10 hours. On the way home after touring Europe, the aviators experienced engine roughness between Lisbon and the Azores. With instruments reading normal, the two pilots debated on which engine was acting up, not wanting to kill the good one 300 miles from land. To troubleshoot, they throttled back one engine at a time, trying to determine which one was the culprit. Eventually, they shut down the left engine, which proved to be the correct decision. Relaying their position through a nearby airliner, they proceeded to the Azores. It turned out that one cylinder of the failed engine had cracked almost all the way around and was within a half an inch of blowing off altogether. My dad and Eddie dined that evening with the crew of the airliner that had relayed the message. Several days later, a new cylinder arrived, allowing completion of the trip. I still have the photo of my dad kissing the good right engine after landing, and the broken cylinder, which his mechanic back home made into a lamp. "We're going down," yelled my father, again grabbing for the wheel. "Harold," replied my mom from the back seat, "leave him alone or you'll kill us all." Having served as a flight surgeon during the Korean conflict, my dad came home with a lot of aeronautical expertise and proceeded to qualify as an aviation medical examiner. He went on to do a great deal of consulting for the FAA, for example, on implementation of their first oxygen recommendations for general aviation, and he wrote a book called The Pilot's Aeromedical Guide. So he became well known in consulting circles. One evening he came home to join the family for dinner, and he said to us all, "Guess where I went today?" And we all looked at each other, unknowing. And he said, "Well, I just got back from the new Sears Tower, which at that time had just been completed." And we were like, wow, that had to be pretty cool. Now, the Sears Tower, upon its completion, was the tallest building in the world and remained so for about 25 years. But in any case, we're like, well, why did you go there? And he said, well, I was called in to consult because they were having a problem there with the elevators. He proceeded to tell us that the elevator ride from the bottom to the 103rd story observation deck was about 1,345 feet. And passengers in the elevators were having ear problems going up and down. And in fact, there was a claim by one passenger that they'd broken an eardrum. So as a result, the building's administration had brought my father in to ask, well, what do we do about this? So he proceeded to ask, what do you think the problem was? And I said, well, how fast was the elevator going? And my dad explained that they wanted to get the passengers up and down quickly, and it was going up and down somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 feet per minute, at which point everyone at the table raised their eyebrows. So my dad said, what do you think I told him? Well, we'd been around flying in airplanes long enough with our dad to have some idea what the standards are, and it's known to every light airplane pilot the standard rate of climb and descent that we use to keep everybody comfortable. So my brother and I blurted out in unison, 500 feet per minute. That's right, said my dad, grinning. That's exactly what I told him. And I charged him $1,000 for it. We loved that green 310 bearing flag decals from so many countries, but the time came when our family of 6 could no longer fit in a 5-place airplane. For a while, one sister rode belted on a cushion in the baggage compartment, field approved by the FAA in those simpler days. But finally my dad bought a newer 6-place model. In it, one special evening, he flew Jean and me across Lake Michigan, along with my mother and future in-laws, to celebrate our engagement. We dined at Win Schuler's restaurant in Marshall, Michigan, then flew back to Chicago. It was the first time our parents had met, and Jean's folks were suitably impressed. Often my parents traveled with other pilot friends flying multiple airplanes on group vacations. My dad became notorious among that group for his unorthodox sense of humor. That made him a captivating storyteller, and incidents he described from those trips remain with me today as richly as my own flying experiences. For example, one time a couple was returning in smooth air from the Bahamas to Chicago. During level flight, their twin-engine Beechcraft Travel Air suddenly ballooned upward several thousand feet. Startled, the pilot reclaimed control from the autopilot and wrestled the airplane back to level flight. After discovering the plane would now fly at only a fraction of its normal cruising speed, he set course for the nearest airport. Not until approaching to land did the pilot discover the source of their problem. The wing flaps were already fully extended. It turned out that while reaching for her purse, his wife had unknowingly caught the flap lever with her sleeve, activating landing flaps while the plane flew at cruise speed. Another pilot, returning from a group trip to Florida, discovered that his Cessna would not fly straight after takeoff. The plane seemed to operate normally in other respects, he explained to my father after landing, but I had to hold full rudder all the way home. Not only was the pilot exhausted from forcefully pushing the rudder pedal for so many hours, but due to concerns about the possible cause, he flew at reduced speed for the entire flight. At this point in the pilot's explanation, his first-time passenger chimed in. "I was suspicious that we might have such a problem even before we left Florida," announced the non-pilot to everyone else's astonishment. "I did my best to fix it." "What did you do?" asked my dad. "I saw that little metal thing in the tail was bent," said the passenger, "so I straightened it before we took off." The object in question was the rudder trim tab, which on this model is adjusted on the ground to make the plane fly straight. Funny as Dad thought this was, he was equally intrigued that neither pilot nor passenger had brought this up during their 8-hour flight. It was a sad day when my father sold his final airplane. Struck down by degenerative disease, he slowly deteriorated physically and mentally. My dad and I never flew much together over the years because he was the kind of guy who mostly put kids in the back seat. But following in his footsteps as a flight instructor, I had the pleasure of delivering him one last joyful flight at the controls. One afternoon when he was lucid, I offered the left seat of a Cessna to fly from Phoenix to Sedona. He did a credible job of taking off and getting us there, though I made the landing. It was a special flight for both of us, at least until he lost the ability to remember. But by now, several years later, my dad could no longer separate real events from imagined ones. While the rest of my family watched in horror, he continued grabbing for the controls, convinced that we were flying through the storm of a lifetime. In reality, we were struggling for the steering wheel of a minivan under clear skies on Interstate 10 between Tucson and Phoenix. After the most trying auto journey of my life, I pulled into our driveway and shut off the engine. With that, my dad sighed relief like a man snatched from death. "Gregory," he said, "that was the best landing anyone's ever made." I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Like many fathers of his day, my dad was spare with praise. In his mind, I had just saved all our lives, and these were admiring words from a 40-year aviator. Suddenly, I knew what to do. I put my arms around him and hugged him. From one pilot to another, I knew I'd never receive a better compliment. Thanks for riding along on today's Flying Carpet adventure. Find photos from most episodes at gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. While there, order one of the few remaining autographed copies of my aviation adventure book, Flying Carpet, The Soul of an Airplane, for which I was named Barnes & Noble Arizona Author of the Month. You'll also find my other aviation books there, and my Views from the Flying Carpet aerial photography available in fine art metal prints. Please support this podcast by sharing your favorite episodes on social media, posting reviews on your favorite podcast directories, and donating via gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. I welcome your feedback via my website, via my Flying Carpet Podcast Facebook group. Finally, follow my social media sites by searching Greg Brown Flying Carpet, and consider joining my Student Pilot Pep Talk Facebook group. Thanks, Carter Olson, for the tagline. Music by Hannes Brown. See you next time.